We are. Welcome back, and give it up from all the way from Australia, Roxy Hall, who's going to talk about why identity politics doesn't work.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you all so much for having me. I have already sort of thanked you all yesterday, but I'll do it again now. And it's really awesome to come all this way. I've spoken at Communist University before. I spoke last year, and I've spoken on the online Communist Forum a few times, but it's good to be here in person and be able to have the discussions. It adds an extra dimension to the conversation that I think is really important. The title of my talk is The Problem of Identity Politics. And in order to kind of go to answer that question, what exactly is the problem of identity politics? How do we answer that quote-unquote problem of identity politics? It requires us to sort of first investigate what identity politics is. This, as a starting point, is somewhat confusing, because identity politics is extremely broad, heterogeneous category. Broadly speaking, we can define identity politics as a political phenomenon, something that's happening at the realm at the level of politics. And we usually use the term identity politics very broadly can mean political movements that are based on identity claims. So that's like kind of philosophical jargon, but basically identity movements, political movements and political ideas or political structures that are intimately linked to a sort of fundamental identity category that a person possesses. But this is very broad. By this notion, or nationalism, all nationalisms are forms of identity politics. And, you know, we could make a critique at this level and say, well, it's essentially kind of sectional and particularist, which is true. And in sort of political science, it's usually counterposed to universalism in politics. You know, these kind of political movements that make political claims about the whole of humanity and beyond even. And we could talk about liberalism, obviously historically as probably the prime example, but also Marxism as kind of a universalist framework. But that isn't really the question I was asked to answer. What we're really talking about when we talk about identity politics is usually something much more specific, which is a phenomenon of the late 20th century and early 21st centuries of political developments, particularly in the advanced capitalist countries. And this form of identity politics is what I'm going to be addressing. And I want to do as best a job as I can to address it. And so in order to do that, I've done quite a bit of reading. And there's lots of different, I guess, approaches that have been put forward. And I really do think the most convincing and what is now considered somewhat of a classic of political science addressing this topic is Wendy Brown's book, States of Injury. Now, Wendy Brown isn't a Marxist. She's Marx-ish, perhaps. Like many academics tend to be, but she's also influenced by Foucault and Nietzsche, and as such, I'm not going to sort of port her argument wholesale, but I do think that she grapples with something very important about the politics of identity. And if we don't understand it, then I think we're going to have a hard time addressing it in the movement. So it's going to be this kind of series of categories that it's going to be the focus of my talk. And as well as that, I'm going to attempt to contextualize this within a historical materialist account of the development and transformation of capitalist society. So I'm going to link what's going on at the level of politics, at the level of the juridico-political apparatus or structure, to what is happening at the level of the capitalist economy, transformations in world politics, etc. So this talk is divided into 4 parts. Forgive me, comrades. The first is a crisis in liberalism. 2nd, failure of the revolution. 3, politics of injury. And 4, overcoming identity politics. So that should take, we have 2 hours. That should take probably half of that, maybe. And then we can discuss hopefully comrades have plenty of thoughts at the end of it. So the first is let's say, begin with a crisis in the liberal state. In the 20th century, liberalism, which had been the historical, ideological, political project of the ascendant bourgeoisie, had hit its apogee in the 19th century. And over the course of the 20th century, liberalism was increasingly hollowed out by the development of the Cold War military permanent arms state and the growth of the sort of administrative state apparatus. In turn, the ideological expression of this was that liberalism's universalism collapsed in the face of the Cold War. The commitments to egalitarianism, social justice, etc., were increasingly undermined, and it is not uncommon today to say that liberalism in contemporary society is a hollow ideology that defends only the most minimal program of individual rights and capitalist property. This hollowing out of liberalism corresponded to the sort of transformations of the capitalist economy and the crisis of created by the Cold War. Liberalism, which at the start of the Cold War had been committed to national self-determination and the sort of universal human rights, by the high Cold War was arming the sort of colonial regimes, engaged in a sort of covert kind of war against the Third World, and an open struggle against the kind of egalitarian social programs of the sort of early 20th century. This, reaches its most full-throated form in what people call neoliberalism. I mean, I don't really love that term, but whatever. In the sort of most atavistic, counter-revolutionary form of liberalism that appears in the middle of the middle and then sort of later part of the 20th century. What is clear, though, is that as the ideological structuring narratives of bourgeois hegemony are increasingly hollowed out by this transformation in liberalism, the question is posed of how does the bourgeoisie manage society in the context of an order where it has no positive vision to offer the people, the masses, the kind of citizenry in classical political sense. This is happening at the same time as you have a connected but separate development. At the same time, the 1960s and 70s, I'm sure we're all familiar with, we see the explosion of social struggles, of social layers who were excluded from the sort of corporatist social order of the post-war consensus. So this takes the form of black power and civil rights, obviously, women's liberation and gay liberation, the youth movement, the student movement, and also things that are perhaps not as obvious or immediate, but like the disability rights movement, as we know, it also appears in this time period. We have, and even the beginnings of the environmental movement, though that's not really related to my talk, but obviously environmentalism has a deeper history, but the modern environmental movement is kind of born in this period. So these movements and their kind of intervention at the level of mass politics break apart the post-war compromise and cause a profound political crisis, which then by the 1970s, in the context of stagflation, the oil shock, etc., is causing, we're seeing a total breakdown of the kind of post-war hegemony. The kind of white male stale hegemony of the post-war world is in crisis. But the social revolution, or the more radical sort of pretensions of these movements are defeated. The revolution doesn't happen in the 60s and 70s or 80s, as we're all aware. And the question is what happens after that? So you have there cannot be a return to the post-war order, which was based on the exclusion of these political groups from public life, from the polity. But there also cannot be, but there is no revolutionary transformation of society, as many of the participants hoped for. I'm not here to talk about why that happened. That's an interesting topic for another time. But suffice to say that the revolution didn't happen. So a new and now a crisis-ridden liberal order is forced to reckon with these movements, which have been politically defeated, but still have fundamentally changed or are changing society. And that there is a necessity to integrate these movements into the state. And the product of this is the official state program of what we might call liberal multicultural state, the sort of liberal, I think multiculturalism really is the model here, and then it also is applied in other ways, but the liberal multicultural state, of which what I'm going to call injury politics, as a particular kind of identity politics, is the dominant ideological expression, at least especially in more radical circles. So what do we mean when we say politics of injury? I hope comrades are able to follow me here, because this is a somewhat nebulous concept, but I think it is it's quite important that we grasp it. The concept of the politics of injury is that these movements, when they're on the retreat, the identity displaces emancipation as the central category of the movement. So these movements, which were fundamentally based on sort of certain identity claims and were aimed at emancipation, identity becomes the kind of becomes the object of the movement itself, the kind of creation, defense, and perpetuation of certain identity categories. This is the investment in these identity categories are based on what Wendy Brown calls wounded attachments. These the sort of in the context of a defeated mass movement or a movement that's on the retreat, there is a inward-looking fixation on the state of injury itself. So the fact that one has experienced oppression, violence, immiseration, etc., becomes the fixation of the movement. That is, the identity is a kind of suffering itself. Being wounded as an identity category, and being a good Foucauldian, Nietzschean, Wendy Brown links this to a kind of slave morality, right? That is the kind of product of this. And I'm not a Nietzschean, but I think there is something of a useful category here, is where the sort of idea that oppression, suffering, immiseration grants a certain moral status is in itself is a kind of natural expression of the oppressed's attempt to sort of justify their own existence, their own suffering. This idea of a slave morality. This politics of injury, in which the status of victimization is intimately linked with identity, and I think that if you have been in these kind of movement spaces, this is a very real kind of thing that people experience, and they feel it very passionately. I'm not going to say that they don't, they really do. What this produces politically, at the level of politics, is a dependence on the state. Because the state then poses itself as the protector of minority groups against a society which otherwise would oppress, harm, dominate them, etc. There is then created a symbiotic relationship between minority communities who feel they need to be protected from the social majority, and the liberal state, which poses as their guarantor. This relationship is the primary way that potentially rebellious social minorities, be they ethnic minorities such as like Black Britons, or in Australia, Indigenous Australians, or recent, migrant youth, etc., or be it sexual minorities like the gay community, etc. This produces a symbiotic relationship with the state, where the state's message is, well, the white majority or the straight majority oppress and discriminate against you, which is true. That's a real experience And the state is the only means by which you can be protected from that discrimination. And the state steps in as the guarantor of this, and it does this through the structures of hate crime legislation, anti-discrimination law, state regulation over society, right? And this produces this like symbiotic relationship. In particular, this dependency on the state is embodied in and benefits a layer of sort of community representatives who serve as intermediaries with the state, right? So, and I think this is pretty commonly observed, but in any kind of minority community, there will be a sort of bourgeois or petty bourgeois layer who are tied to the sort of institutions of that relationship. In most cases today, that's really like the NGO sphere is really the main kind of space this happens, but also in the kind of community associations, you know, you'll have the sort of petty bourgeois leadership of the community, and they sort of, their job is to mediate between the state and the minority group in that symbiotic relationship. I don't like making arguments by allegory, but I think the relationship between sort of the way that the trade union bureaucracy serves as an intermediary or representative of the relationship between capital and labor, and kind of benefits from that kind of benefits from mediating that relationship is a pretty good allegory for this kind of politics. And the politics, there is a good reason why this kind of politics of injury have been seized upon by the trade union leadership. The political culture that is produced by this this injurious politics is one of inward-looking narcissistic, and fundamentally embrace. I mean, I will like be a bit of a Nietzschean here. It is a slave morality in which suffering is kind of held as a moral good. You know, the more you suffer, the more kind of moral weight that you carry. You know, I've been through so many terrible things, and this produces a culture in which weakness. The weakness of this political subject, and I'm being vague because it applies in racial questions and sexuality questions and stuff, is valorized and reproduced. And thus the dependency on the state is valorized and reproduced. We are victims of very real discrimination. I want to make it clear, but the objective driver here is very real discrimination and oppression that, you know, that is fixated upon in the political sphere, which reinforces the fact that we need the state in order to defend our interests from a majority who hates and despises us, which in turn makes us politically disorganized, dependent on the state, and weak, which only furthers our dependency on the state. It is a deadly cycle which only weakens and conservatizes and politically neutralizes the oppressed, these minority groups. And the primary beneficiaries of this, apart from the bourgeoisie who use this to rule over an increasingly hollowed out and divided society, is the main beneficiaries of this are the sort of petty bourgeois administrators of this condition, is the community leaders, is the, you know, be it religious figures, be it NGO heads, and the people who run the, you know, the gay and lesbian organizations, etc., who are able to pose themselves as the representatives of the community, and thus receive state patronage. I think what's interesting is that in the wake, this politics became hegemonic, I would say. This kind of mode of organizing the liberal democracies became hegemonic, and then went into its own crisis, right? Because we're now talking about something, you know, all the stuff I've been talking about is something that's now in a deep social kind of structural crisis. And that structural crisis is because the epoch of capitalism to which it corresponded, which was the post-1970s restructuring of world capitalism in the context of and then obviously the collapse of the Soviet Union, you know, triumphal liberal capitalism, etc., went into crisis in 2008 and then again in 2020. I think what's interesting today is that there is still not a real alternative to this being offered by any faction of bourgeois politics. In fact, the right, who are obviously opposed to this and have made a lot of hay out of opposition to this, and have made a lot of hay out of a lot of working people's skepticism towards this, their demands are for basically a version of this structure but for white men. You know, what we want is we want this same structure of state patronage, but we want it for white men. We want, they all sort of say, oh, we want, there's the classic complaint about this is about, university places. They'll sort of say, oh, well, it should be meritocratic and we shouldn't have affirmative action, etc. But when the affirmative action is gotten rid of, and you still have, say, for example, girls getting degrees at far higher rates than young men, their response is, well, actually, no, we need essentially affirmative action for white boys so that they get all good places at universities. This is like, so the demand of the right is actually just, oh, well, no, we just want our own version of this patronage relationship so that we can shore up the now like kind of weakening privileged like readouts of our kind of declining masculinity and kind of racial privilege, etc. So what does this mean for us politically? I realize that I actually have spoken a lot shorter than I am. I'm too concise. This is my problem. How can we overcome identity politics? This is, I think that this has been something that's been discussed a lot on the left. It's not like kind of unique to say. And the usual thing people will say is we need to return to class politics, which is like true, right? We need to return to placing class struggle at the center of politics. But that doesn't actually really tell us much. And I want to also be clear that that's like, there are good and bad ways of doing that. So the question is return to class politics, but on what basis? I think that a kind of negative and sort of apprehension of this is some on the left who embrace a kind of working class identity politics, which is to say we need to do identity politics, but for, blue collar life. We have this kind of valorization, which is really more conservative than Marxist, of, the hardy-handed son of toil, who is, virtuous because he, wears blue overalls and hits a steel girder with a hammer, this kind of image of the working class. And I think there's definitely sections of the left that kind of indulge in this, particularly those who have fantasies about returning to kind of Keynesian industrial policy. Well, if we just build a bunch of factories or get guys to like dig holes and fill them in again, then everybody will go back to having jobs at the steel mill and it'll be the 1960s all over again. And it's not going to happen. But it also totally elides the reality of the contemporary working class, which if you look at any of the statistics, if you look at what the working class looks like in a country like Britain, what the working class looks like in a country like Australia, is firstly it's much more female than it was historically, and also it's much more migrant, it's young, and this image doesn't correlate to this working class identity politics. A sort of more sophisticated version, but similar, is that we should return to the class by just going back to bread and butter issues and neglecting what, I don't know, the Trotskyists would call it special oppression. I don't know what kind of terminology to use, but we should just neglect these questions or they're too divisive, If we take a principled position on migration, won't that alienate us from the working class? You hear this from the ICL or Spartacists, right? But you hear this from other groups as well, we shouldn't take a good position on the trans question. I mean, it's not really very controversial in Australia, but in Britain it's extremely controversial, right? So this kind of stuff is, I think that the problem with this, beyond the fact that I think it's kind of neglectful of our duty, is that it just returns to a kind of economism, which sees the if we just address the kind of, wages and hours demands of the working class, then that will kind of allow us to get a kind of, war of inches our way to political struggle over the nature of the state. But I think Lenin thoroughly put that idea to bed 100 years ago, and I don't need to do it again. My view and I feel this is in alignment with most of the comrades here, is that we need to return to the essential premise of Marxism, all the way back in Marx's own writings, in the program of the French Workers' Party, etc., which is that the emancipation of the proletariat is the emancipation of the whole of humanity that suffers and languishes under all these different kinds of oppression, without regard for race and sex. I mean, it says so in the program of the French Workers' Party. Today we would probably add sexuality, etc., but it is the fundamentally correct framework. And that what this means is that the reason for this is because of the nature of the proletariat, which is a class that is stripped of their property by the development of modern capitalist society. It is a class that has an objective interest in the emancipation of the whole of humanity through the overthrowing of private property and the creation of a socialized economy which will finally emancipate the human race from, drudgery and domestic oppression and racial oppression, etc. This means that the struggle for women's emancipation against racism, for gay lib, for trans lib, for a clean biosphere and a healthy planet, though that's not really covered here, but I think comrades get the point, that these are part and parcel of the struggle for working class emancipation, of as much working class demands as wages, hours, or conditions. They are part of the working class's struggle for emancipation. And only by taking on all of these political questions can the working class learn to be a ruling class, can learn to rule society. The bourgeoisie understands, because it is the ruling class, that all the realms of human existence belong to it. The bourgeoisie, everything from the questions of art and culture through to the movement of atoms and the functioning of the weather, all of this is the domain of capital. All of it is the domain of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie has a historic class interest in all of this. And it is because it is the ruling class. The ruling class sees all of society as its domain. The working class, if it is going to become the ruling class, must similarly learn that lesson. It must learn that every single question posed in society is a question being posed to the working class. This is what Lenin meant when he talked about tribunes of the people, tribunes of the oppressed, right? Was that by taking up the struggle of oppressed minorities, even when it didn't directly relate to the questions of workers' organization, the working class would learn it would exercise this muscle of social hegemony. So it's only on that basis, a renewed, revived, living Marxism, which is capable of taking up these questions, in engaging with them, building on the sort of decades of theoretical kind of development, but at a very fundamental level is a very orthodox kind of foundational Marxism. Only that, I think, can really answer this question and put the very simple case to working people everywhere, which is that the emancipation of all oppressed is intimately bound up with the emancipation of the working class, and thus the transition away from class society into communism. That's all my notes. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll open the floor for discussion. Please raise your hand if you want to say something. And when it's your turn, please mention your name, because I don't know or remember everyone's name, so it might be easier for the discussion. I see in the hand of Anne. Well, Anne.
Can I come to the front?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you. So my name is Anne, as you just said. So I think it's very interesting, this concept of injury politics, and I would really like echo my own experience of the way in which that manifests itself. So in Ireland, I'm not in any political group, more or less because I'm not allowed to join any of them, because of my connection with the Weekly Worker and the fact that they know that, you know, open discussion will follow and reports on the meetings and etc. But what I am involved in, what I have been very involved in, is the Palestine Solidarity Movement, which in Ireland is a big movement, and in Cork, where I live, it's got a proper organisation, which is a lot more democratic than the left groups themselves, ironically. Okay, so one of the things that is a constant problem is intersectionalism. So, like, and I find that intersectionalism benefits the bureaucrats. So whenever we're having a discussion, which is contentious, so, you know, we had a discussion about imperialism, and so the person who doesn't want to make the decision says, but where are the Palestinians? We don't have any Palestinians here, or there are only 2 Palestinians. We need to be led by what Palestinian people want. We're only there to serve them, rather than, you know, decide ourselves what's best for them. It happens with transgender people a lot, as well. Now, I have to say, in Ireland, it's not the same issue at all as it is in Britain. And there are very many transgender people involved in politics, many young people, and I think it's absolutely excellent. And I admire people for being able to decide how they want to live their own lives. But many of those people don't really put their issues on us. It's their comrades that cause the problem. Somehow, like, it's like a protective thing. But ultimately, it's about a sliding scale of privilege. So there have been big arguments in Ireland on social media a few years ago between men, white working class men, and feminists, who I also would put a lot of responsibility for on this, for this problem, and trying to get through the kind of social identities. And anyway, so it was like, is a white middle class, you know, probably very privileged in terms of economic privilege woman, is she up or down? And like, and then the men who were putting this forward were very genuine people who'd had like difficult lives, you know, growing up, and they're saying, well, no, you're above me because you have had a university degree, you've never had to fight for anything. So actually, I find you more sanctimonious. So like, it was a ridiculous argument, but it went on for a long time. And I argued with some feminists, and then got blocked over it, because you could only agree, you couldn't disagree, you couldn't raise any issues. And then just like, finally, just to say that I'll be speaking about the rise of the right in Ireland tomorrow, but within that, there's often, again, I'm talking social media, because you don't usually end up having, in the circles I move in, having too many face-to-face arguments with people who support the right. But they often say, well, we're not even allowed to say that there's a problem with migrants. We're not even allowed to say that this is an issue. Because, of course, for anybody on a common sense, you know, taking a common sense approach, they go, we haven't got enough housing. These people are coming in. Yes, they're getting shit housing, but they're getting housing. Yes, they're getting bad benefits, but they're getting benefits. So you have to tackle that and, you know, put forward arguments about the need for open borders, you know, the relationship of the working class to migrants. You know, you must take on those issues. But as far as the left, and I'm particularly putting my finger on the Socialist Worker Party in Ireland, which is people for profit, is just, that's racist. You can't say that. That makes you a racist, and therefore, like, it blocks a discussion. And ultimately, I think it's a way of us preventing any discussion, real discussion that like deals with very real questions. It's a very superficial approach to to the divisions within society. So anyway, that's all.
Thank you.
Let's say thank you.
Thank you. I'm Marcus. So that was really interesting presentation. I think central to it, I think, is that identity politics creates this dependence on the state. And I think it's something, I think you're correct to have looked at multiculturalism as a source of emergence for this, that anti-racism from below, in some senses, is a form of militant working class assimilation. I know assimilation is meant to be bad, but actually working class cultures coming together, assimilating to be the best they can be, learning from each other, is, I would say, a positive form of assimilation, not assimilation to the state and to the bourgeois order. And I think that by dividing migrant communities along their identity, you create these, they become supplicants to the state. And I think that pattern is elsewhere. In Sydney, Sydney has a very proud and loud militant gay culture that goes back to the 70s, the gay liberation movement. The first Pride protests in the 1970s were beaten up by the cops and attacked, and it was very much seen as sexual liberation. And it is morphed into massive big business. The Pride is a month-long festival in Sydney. It is one of the biggest tourism attractions in the city. It is a massive big business, and the Pride Committee has been riven with debates and discussion, and they've just expelled the Pride and Protest group. But the Pride and Protest group that has been contesting the bourgeoisification of this movement, if you can call it that, they've been doing it on the basis of identity politics, I think. And I think they have not looked to, and their protest has been very, very weak. I think central to it is this denial of theory, that being the experiential aspect takes priority over generalized theoretical conclusions. And I think it's important to have diversity, not to have all male tables and speakers. To try and learn from people's experience is important, because our theory improves from that. But to say that if you're not black, you can't possibly understand. I mean, there's an element of truth to it, but it's not true either. It's also not true, because as humans, we are constantly trying to understand beyond our own experience. It's almost a definition of being human in some sense. And I think it's that denial of universalism and understanding is important. I can tell you asserted that liberalism's universalism collapsed in the Cold War. I'm not sure if that's true or if it's important, but it rose a question mark to me. In the Palestinian movement, there's a lot of, you've always got to wear the keffiyeh, and you've always, you've got to have this performative solidarity constantly, which I find very tiring, but you can't just say Palestine, you have to say Palestine, and you can't say Israel, you have to say so-called Israel. And now people say so-called Australia and so-called, I mean, and this, by saying that, your politics are better. And I think that is an example of identity politics in the movement, which is bad. So, and I think Anne's touched on it, I'll finish on this, not just the identity politics itself, but the politics around it. So there are things, so the right wing gets up and says, oh, you're not even allowed to say it. Farage gets into Parliament, says Pauline Hanson. Trump says, oh, you're not even allowed to say it. And these are some of the most powerful people in the world. But it strikes a chord with people, because if what they said was completely irrelevant to a lot of people's experience, it wouldn't strike a chord. I think there is a political correctness gone mad element to identity politics that seeks to ban debate, ban conversations, ban certain words. So the politics around it, as well as the politics, I think, are important. I'll use this as an example. It's quite late in Australia, so I probably won't get cancelled for saying this. But there's a slogan in the Aboriginal land rights movement, which I have sympathy with, which is always was, always will be Aboriginal land. It is said as a mantra in amongst left-wing circles. And like, I haven't got a problem with it at one level, but if you actually think about it, it's just wrong. It wasn't always Aboriginal land. I mean, the continent of Australia is millions and millions and millions of years old that existed before human beings were even there. And will it always be Aboriginal land? No, it won't always. In fact, it's not Aboriginal land now. That's the whole possession, the whole thing about colonial possession of the land. And if you were to say this in a meeting or challenge it, you would be called racist. And so that element of you can't even say. And I think that there's an element within, as workers who don't have political consciousness enter political campaigning, they don't come, you know, they haven't all gone to Cambridge and got a PPE and gone to the correct, you know, political correct, you know, student movement that they've all been through. And so if they get told off as they're entering politics, that you can't say that, that's racist, you're sexist, you're homophobic, you're transphobic, people will go, oh, you're not even allowed to say blah, blah, blah. So I think there is an element to IDPOL that gives the right wing an audience on these things and gives them a power to cut into the working class and to win workers to reactionary ideas. And I mean, I will sum it up by saying, until the left can be irreverent and funny again, we're fucked, I think. Because, and I think if you can't make fun of yourself and your own movement, and you police words, I think that is a complete barrier. And I think that does come from identity politics. So thanks.
Thank you. We're from Australia and we are listening, Mark. So you guys still have.
I've been on camping already.
There's a few people saying, Marcus, you can't say that, but I got a joke, so we're safe. So I think the left has rediscovered its humor. I really enjoyed your opening. Thank you, Roxy. I think it's very important that you identified, you know, the question of identity politics as a question of defeat. It's part of the defeat of the workers' movement, and I think we have to understand that. I don't think that's how it's universally seen. It's universally seen as this is the new way we have to move forward. This is how you win over workers. You know, you have to you know, meet them where they are and in their identities, and that's how you bring them on, rather than say, actually, we think we should all become Marxist and, you know, working class. It's the class question has been replaced with identity, how you are, rather than of what you could become and what you should become to achieve human, you know, liberation, universal human liberation. And I think it's not just born out of a period of defeat, of our defeat as a class globally, but also it remains a policy of defeat. I think if we stick with identity politics, we can never actually win the majority of the working class to our program. There are different identities for a start. And, you know, you tell them, as Marcus said, you cannot say that. If you join our organization, you cannot question A, B, C, D, E. And here's the gospel. And unless you agree with it, you know, you're out. And I'm sure it's the same in Australia as it is. But in Britain, I think the last week, I think there's 3 organizations have imploded over the trans question, you know, which has become the hot potato. And it's discussed as it's not up for debate. So, you know, our organization, the Socialist Federation is the last one, or the Socialist Education Discussion, Social Education and Debate Association starts off with, it's not up for debate. You know, a trans woman is a woman. Unless you say yes to that fully, you cannot join us. I personally think a trans woman is a woman. A lot of people don't. You know, do we have to find agreement? Do we have to require philosophical agreement on this one point? And unless we do, we cannot build a communist party. And you can only join the communist party if you say A or B to it. Is, I think, has become, in Britain at least, the most toxic question. It's used to keep people out, of course. You know, it's used to keep you pure. Whereas I think, as we've said, you know, we actually should concentrate on the solidarity aspect of it. You know, that we do defend trans comrades, our trans comrades and brothers and sisters, that we do fight for, you know, healthcare, etc. We do all of these things. We oppose the Supreme Court ruling. You know, we oppose toilet checks. You know, that you have to be only biological women have to. If you're born as a woman, you have to use the women's toilet. It doesn't matter what happens the rest of your life. It's outrageous, and we have to oppose those things. But unless we're able to say this question is up for debate, for the simple fact it is being debated. The left is entirely split in Britain, and it's tearing itself apart, and it's going into smaller and smaller circles, which is you know, it's helping the right. It's defeating us. It's defeating us as a movement. It stops us building any kind of party. You know, there's other reasons as well, but these kind of the identity politics creates with it the need for bureaucracy, doesn't it? It does require the need for speech controls. It does require the need to stop debate. You cannot say A, you cannot say B, so you need to have a complaints departure. You need to have codes of conduct. You need to have rules on this and that, and you cannot say that, and you cannot quote Marx from whenever, you know, because that word it's not usable anymore, and if you use it, you campaign for ABC. You know, it has become a culture which will make sure we remain defeated. You know, I'm not accusing anybody of being a police agent, etc., but this kind of policy makes sure we'll never win, and we'll always stay defeated. So I think we do need to focus on active you know, acts of solidarity, how we can, and things like in our draft program, we have made a change to our draft program. I'm actually not sure if it's in it, that we do want to overcome this idea that you have to register gender on all documents, you know, that you have to, and that's, I think, some sort of a bit of a trap that both the materialists, feminists step into, as well as the many trans activists, is that you have to choose either male or female. You have to choose, and you know, unless you choose, that's not proper. You know, but where say, well, why? You know, you could be. We should people to allow to do whatever they want. They should have the same rights anyway. It doesn't matter. You don't have to choose either one. That forcing them into this binarity is the wrong way. So. Yeah, so it is up for debate because it is being debated. I think that is a key issue, and that we need to be able, as if we are serious about building a communist party that can make a real change, that you have to allow debate and discussion on those things. You know, not obviously allowing transphobia, etc., but that you have to be able to discuss these things without people, you know, shutting you down because it's not up for debate. Thank you. Thank you. Well,
Hi, thanks, Roxy. I thought it was a very intelligent synopsis. I really enjoyed it. Few points. I like basically identity politics when it highlights injustices of a particular group, Black Lives Matter, for example, and various Black history societies. I think they highlight important issues for our society. I like identity politics when they counter a predominant narrative based on a liberal Tory interpretation of history, and a history based on superiority of one race. And I like identity politics when they highlight discrimination, why some sections of society have the right to something when other sections don't, the LGBTQ plus community, for example. I think we can learn from these particular sections, particularly these groups of society. My problem with identity politics generally, and I think other speakers have spoken about it, is that organisations campaigning for particular rights tend to have a limited vision, and they single issue campaigns. They, I think, ultimately they're reformists. They ignore the trans base, and they're not transformists, which I think is an important point. Now, that's not to say we ignore campaign organisations. We don't. I think we need to take a tactical approach to them, particularly solidarity movements, as Tina pointed out. I remember during 40 years ago when I first started to get involved in politics, lesbians and gays support the miners during the very important miners' strike during 1984. I think that organisation was militant. It broke down perceived ideas within the working class towards the gay community, and it was class-based. It was transformative. It offered a greater vision. Your point about the state as a guarantee of rights, again, I think you're right. I think you made an important point there. I think looking at some of the organisations in the states, for example, the state itself, you've got a police strategy subsequent to the George Floyd killing in 2002. The CIA put out a recruitment campaign called Humans of CIA in order to try and combat the racism towards the CIA. And it also targeted queer and indigenous people to recruit to the CIA in order to improve its image. The army itself continually has ads featuring black soldiers. And I think Trump, since his re-election, it's been very useful for him as a backlash with his particular politics to this particular approach. And he's now appealing to white rights in the States. And you have the issue of banning critical race theory and censorship of books from schools and school curriculum, and the aggressive attacks on drag queens and what they're supposed to represent in the state. So I think the point, the state as a guarantee of rights was well made.
Thank you. Yes.
I think you made a very good point about how states encompassed all of this, and actually the patronage. I like the way, and I like your allegory with trade unions. It's a bit, you're a negotiator between the states. What probably originated all this was the weakness of Western working class at a time when post-war there was a better situation for the working class, in especially US, Europe. And then they came across liberation movements. So for the left, there was the concept of masses in Africa, Middle East, Latin America, fighting against imperialism. And then they were seeing their own working class accepting a better living standard. Yeah? And therefore not being as revolutionary as they were definitely during the war or pre-war. I think that led them to look at alternative audience. So it was a pragmatic approach for this left. Mike goes on about US Mao's, I'll let him explain that. But it's not just, I think it wasn't just the US Maoists. I think for the left, that whole aristocracy of the labor movement, benefiting from the progress of the West, and then these other groups. And yes, in the US, they did look with Black power, Black women, but it was bigger than that. They were the ones they could see. Now, you're absolutely right that by the time we got to 1980s, capitalism was facing a crisis. So the working class was changing. Already large numbers. If you look at Britain, we had the miners' strike. Huge numbers were being made unemployed. So we are no longer in that period, and yet the left has moved on, right? So the left is somewhere else, the working class is somewhere else, and there is never a conciliation between these two ideas. So we then get institutions and patronage of the state institutions careers built on this whole concept. So people become expert on diversities. They are the diversity officer in a university and so on. So then the left should have stood back and said, oh, well, this is a different, even if you're pragmatic, or I'm not using the word opportunist, but even if you're pragmatic, you have to look at the situation and say, okay, we're in a different situation. Let's look at something else, right? And they didn't. They stayed on and they moved on with it. And I think they have lost the white working class. I mean, if you talk to people who are white working class, they do think they are the oppressed of today. It's a false it's a false concept. But that false concept just won't go away by you saying, no, no, there are people more oppressed than you. You have to be representing their interest, understanding their concern, and fighting for their concern. Just to give you an example, so it's become this whole politics of identity has moved on now to the circle, to the global south, right? And especially people who are westernized, who are intellectuals, go on and on about this. So you hear people telling you, it isn't the working class in Iran who's fighting Israelism and the reactionary state. It's the women's movement, the working class, the gay, lesbian community, transgenders, the national minorities, yeah? And I agree, all these people are fighting, but they're not, it's not all at the same level. So they said you can't put working class demands because what about women's demands? And you say, well, part of the women's movement is actually supporting liberal, bourgeois liberal ideas. So yes, I want to represent the women's movement, but from a working class point of view, I want to represent the interests of the for example, for the lesbian gay community in Iran, there has never been a problem if you're rich. Because you don't have to, you live your life, you live in a society, in a part of this town where no one cares about such issues. But if you're working class, it's a serious problem. You can get stoned by your neighbors, never mind the state, yeah? So the idea that all of identity politics has to have a class perspective, I think is very important. And losing that class perspective makes us into followers of bourgeois careers.
I'll go myself. Hold on, you need to unmute yourself then.
Okay, cool. So Amanda, thank you. I think it's very much in line with what Jasmine just said, that in my experience on the left, the history of identity politics and intersectionalism is so, well, little known actually, that usually when you are in a discussion on the left in the Netherlands, in my experience, people will see me, know which organization I'm from and think, ooh, that's a woman. She might be less bad than the men in her organization because she might actually consider intersectionalism, like she might get it, that this is the thing that we should do. And then you get in discussion and usually I start my spiel, the US Maoist, the history of identity politics, intersectionalism, why I disagree, why I want to focus on class politics, and why I think identity politics and intersectionalism moves away from class politics. And when you get into the history, usually eyes glaze over and they're like, oh, well, two things, or, oh God, she's one of the bad ones, and they just turn around, move away. Or they are actually, like, sometimes you get a bit of a discussion, but usually the people that you are in a discussion about intersectionalism with don't know the history. They will not know what you're talking about, which I find really strange, because if you are a left, well, consider themselves Marxist activists, but have no idea what the history is of the people that they are, like the theories of the people that they are engaging with, that makes not a lot of sense. And I feel like that's this is kind of preaching for the choir, because I haven't heard anyone here really defend intersectionalism or identity politics. But how come that this big group, considering themselves Marxist, has no clue about the history of what they are doing. And I think now in the Netherlands we have kind of a spike in the intersectionalism discussion because it's gone a bit more mainstream. But I'm going to ask one of the Dutch comrades to explain this a little further because they have listened to way more of the interviews that I have, but I think it is an example that might be very interesting for everybody to hear. So please someone raise a hand if they are going to speak on that. And I mean, like Yasmin said, I'm assuming Mike will talk about US Maoists and the history of identity politics, so I will just also don't talk about that. And then quickly, as chair, I still have Mike, Jack, and then Gus, and then I'm going to give the floor back to Roxy, and then everyone wants to come back in. Just, you can put up your hand, but I'll give you the floor after Roxy has been come back. So, Mike.
Yeah, Roxy, thanks for that very interesting introduction. I agree with a lot of it. I'm going to pinpoint some issues on which I have some disagreement. I think liberalism and conservatism are both produced by capitalism. You know, so that it's wrong to think of there's a point at which liberalism is totally in the ascendant, and then in the Cold War liberalism is emptied out, because in a sense, the Cold War is a period of the ascendancy of a certain peculiar form of conservatism, which makes an alliance between conservatism and the Labour movement in order to have the nation state and the trade union movement as ally of the nation state. The Liberals, of course, again, one of the high points of liberalism, the 1832 Reform Act, at least the victory of liberalism by expanding the suffrage of the bourgeoisie. What does the bourgeoisie deliver out of the 1832 Reform Act is the new poor law and the generalization of the workhouse and the Tolpavel martyrs, the illegality, outright illegality of trade unions and the people getting sent to Australia as convicts. So it's this two-sided presence of liberalism and conservatism, but also that neoliberalism is not something new liberalism, it's just liberalism, what liberalism is like otherwise. Secondly, in relation to the narrative, yeah, I have talked about US Maoism, and just to flag it, Joe Freeman, who wrote Tyranny of Structuralists, also wrote an important article called Trashing in the same period. It was about how the US women's movement splintered into 1,000 different pieces over conflicts between white women and black women and heterosexual women and lesbians and mothers and non-mothers, etc., etc., etc. But then very quickly, it's not initiated by the state, but it's picked up by once the documents came out, COINTELPRO, the infiltrators went heavy on this up and running with it in order to create splits. It does go back further. Gary Becker, The Economics of Discrimination in the 1950s, argues that the working class is the source of racism and not capital on marginalist grounds. He had difficulty publishing, but the University of Chicago economics faculty paid for him to be published. Surprise, surprise, what the politics of it is. The US Libertarian Party in the early 1970s is gung-ho for the idea that we need to think of this society's coalition of minorities. The most important is the property minority. The oppressed, there's a load of science fiction of the oppressed millionaire from the 1970s. And then it's picked up, wake of Vietnam, the US Army nearly breaks up over the race question because the civil rights movement spreads into the army in the anti-Vietnam War movement, and the Department of Defense becomes gung-ho for anti-discrimination. So it comes from the center of the United States state, from the Defense Department, from the armed forces. The other side, this comes from victory for it's the Trotskyist standard thing that the People's Front fails. The People's Front is disastrous. It fails to stop fascists. Well, yes, but then in 1941 we get global People's Front of the USSR and the USA and the UK and the British Empire. Of the liberals versus fascism, and under the banner of that global People's Front, all the national liberation movements, all the expansion of the socialist camp. Yeah, so that, and then the civil rights movement, that looks like a victory. You know, on the basis of the issue, prioritize the issue of race and forget about the issue of class. That looks like a victory. And it's because it looks like a victory to the left that it keeps coming back and coming back and coming back, that we keep trying to repeat 1941 to 50, and we keep trying to repeat the victory of the civil rights movement. The other side, Harry Haywood, one of the earliest US Maoists, complained bitterly about the fact that the CPUSA was doing all this performative, you've got to use the right language and imagery stuff on its own members, and not fighting the white racial supremacists among the trade union bureaucracy. It was two sides of the same coin, was being friendly with the trade union bureaucracy on the one hand and wanting to harass the rank and file for not being sufficiently performatively anti-racist and anti-sexist on the other hand. And that, it seems to me, is still part of the story. So.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I enjoyed your talk, great. And I thought that the contributions from the floor have been very interesting. And I was gonna come at things from a sort of slightly different angle though, because I think you did ask, is anyone going to defend identity politics? And I thought Bob made a very interesting contribution in that sense, because if, for example, as you did, you said nationalism is a form of identity politics, I would agree with you. So what about oppressed nationalities? What do we expect them to do? Do we really expect them to say, I'm oppressed, I'm going to become a Marxist? Well, some individuals might. Chances are, if you go to Australia, I suspect, with the First People, whatever they're called at the present time, my guess would be that whatever they call themselves, the majority aren't going to turn around and say, oh, I'm a Marxist. They're going to turn around and say, I'm black, or whatever the particular designation happens to be in Australia, and we're dumped upon. And in that sense, if you think back, I mean, Mike and me are roughly the same age. If you think about gay people, well, gay people have always been around, in the sense that they've existed in culture. We all knew that certain MPs, we all knew that certain public figures. But when you had the Gay Liberation Front going, hey, we're gay, we're proud, right? That was different. And in the same way with the women's movement, right? Well, women, you said that the working class is more female. What you meant is the workforce. Exactly. Because women have always been, roughly speaking, half the population, right? So when you saw in the 60s, right, a situation, I can remember, like, in the old days, people just used to watch television, right? I can remember, no, because what else was there in our boring 1950s lives, right? True, right? I can remember, can't remember the date, 68, 69, 67, I can't remember the date, someone might know it, of when there was Miss World on TV, right? 68. And I remember, because I was watching the fucking thing, then these women started throwing flower bombs at it. I went, ah! My dad went, what a damn disgrace. Well, I think that was something to celebrate, right? And I wouldn't expect those women to turn around and say, we're Marxists. Some might, right? But I think I think we're seeing things through the wrong end of the telescope. I know the problem that comrades face. We've just been through the N-word crisis, or whatever you want to call it, controversy in Britain. So there's obviously a problem there, right? But I do think that we're sort of looking at things from the wrong angle. And okay, so we talk, I mean, I sort of go with Mike more, you know, in terms of, is liberalism hollowed out? Is it finished? I know that there's a resurgence of conservatism. I would actually more talk about the decline and the collapse of social democracy in the sense of the social democratic consensus. That's gone, right? And in that sense, I also think that we need to understand. I mean, I sort of picked up, I mean, I will have that discussion with Marcel, and I'll be very interested to hear that. Look, do we really think that in, you know, countries like Britain, Australia, France, Italy, the advanced capitalist countries, that the working class is going to say, oh, we're not going to have higher living standards because this is the exploitation of the third world? No, they're not going to do that. And we shouldn't expect them to. We shouldn't guilt trip them, because the fact of the matter is, although the capitalists in the 50s and 60s boasted about how high the living standards were compared with the Soviet Union, that was one. That wasn't, I mean, I don't like Lenin's description of crumbs. They are sort of crumbs, but they were one. And so, you know, if you take the situation post-45 in Britain, I don't know about other countries, I suspect it's broadly the same, right? We were in a situation of where the working class, or people in factories, workplaces, could go on strike, and they would go on strike literally for minutes and win a concession. There was a comedy show in Britain called The Rag Trade,
Yeah.
right? And the female shop steward had a whistle, and every episode she would all out, and that was true, right? So again, should we be, you know, looking at these workers and saying, oh, they were just living off the benefits of imperialism? I think that would be a mistake. Surely, I mean, loads of these strikes were led by members of the Communist Party, you know. Anyway, so that's just a few thoughts. So yeah, to me, the question is, when we take women, gay people, racial ethnic minorities, whatever we want to call them, it's the failure of the party, it's the failure of a party project to hegemonize that. And what we have is a left. I mean, I just found, I mean, I put the title in, I think it's the lead letter in this week's Weekly Worker, The Clash of Titans between the RCP, the Revolutionary Communist Party, because it's got 1,300 members, and the SWP. I mean, this says something about the left at the present time. You know, when I hear comrades in socialist, communist unity, we've got 100 members. And we're meant to, I mean, okay, we haven't got 100 members. But the point would be that, you know, if you take the idea of party, right, what we're talking about is part of the working class. We're talking about, you know, of necessity, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. And so I just think that in terms of our task, I can understand why comrades get frustrated, because what you've got is a left that cannot relate to the working class, right? It is incapable of approaching the working class. And therefore, what it does, in order to sort of reproduce itself on this sort of pathetic level, is precisely follow one form of identity politics or another. It's tailist, and it's no longer tailing a powerful working class. It's tailing, well, every petty bourgeois fad, which Anyway, so I think I've made my point.
Thank you. Good.
Thank you. Yeah, kind of. My name is Gus. I kind of wanted to add on to the why it doesn't work, because in a sense it does for HR advisors. There's this whole industry. It doesn't work for building a united party. I kind of wanted to add on with a Dutch experience, because we've been having we've had a intersectionalist party for the last few years. It's slowly collapsing, but I think it really shows why it doesn't work, even when there are honest people in it. What just fails to really put forward any project. And some things were mentioned earlier, and Marcus spoke about the language issues that was very prominent in this party, for example. But so maybe just to give some background first, this intersectionist party started out within a split from the Labour Party, the Dutch Labour Party, by Turkish nationalists who denied the Armenian genocide, and then one of the leaders split off and started an intersectionist party. And since then, you really saw all kinds of people flock to it, from Black evangelical Christian Zionists to Palestine activists, the whole range. And it was pretty clear that these language issues just failed to produce any kind of organization. So I remember at one point we invited a speaker who was kind of the ideologue of this party. And she said, yeah, you're talking about Marxism. The black cleaners can't understand any Marxism. They don't know what class is, so just don't talk about it. And I also remember at one point an interviewer pushed one of the party leaders because she had a Zionist background, and then she said, yeah, but I'm autistic, so I can't answer your questions. It's beyond parody almost. But and what you really saw in this project was it couldn't build any kind of organization. Every branch collapsed within months. Representatives in local councils just didn't show up, called in sick for months. And the only way it was united was around this founding member, who was a celebrity. Before that, she was the Dutch. She was a presenter from the Dutch equivalent of MTV, so she would present music clips, and that was her background. And when she left, the whole thing just fell apart. They didn't manage to get any seats in parliament. They were in parliament briefly, and then they left. And now the only real solution they found is, we'll just find another celebrity. And they found an ex-Green Party parliamentarian who was willing to take the job. And then it failed, and then they tried to do the same in the Amsterdam City Council. Well, we'll just put him forward there, and okay, they got in. He left. Oh, I didn't. Did not. So I think that's really the only way these kind of parties can unite, is kind of around like a central figure, because it only really becomes it can only really work as a vehicle for either career politicians or the whole industry of advisors, HR advisors, and I think that's where the problem lies. And I think I agree with Jack there that the issues aren't Black Lives Matter demonstrations or Palestine demonstrations. That's not the issue. We should cheer those on, politicize them and educate them and involve them. But the problem is the left itself has abandoned the class politics. So it's not just a return to class politics and having a program, which I agree we can unite around the program. But then if you see how a lot of these parties work, is even Marxists, self-declared Marxists, would oppose intersectionalism, at least say they would, roughly in the N-word discussion is really telling there, will operate on the same way of unity around philosophical questions, speech controls, and I think that really is the thing we need to combat there. It's not just it's not just saying it doesn't work, and it's also really within working class parties we have to fight this kind of politics within our own ranks, even more than go against one career politician there, one career politician there. So yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you. Then we've got one comment online in terms of Paul?
No, he
No?
doesn't
No?
want to speak.
Okay, no.
Him, yeah.
I really enjoyed that. Thank you very
No,
much.
you have to
You
stand
know,
here. You have to stand here. I've
Yeah, hi. I really enjoyed that, and it clarified a number of issues for me. I just wanted to sort of bring up some kind of historical issues that in terms of the whole trans debate. I was involved in a solidarity network about 15 years ago, and that's quite significant arms to it, and it sort of different projects came out of it and so on. We had it was around the time when this kind of issue blew up, and one of the things that was particularly an issue in our locality, you know, and was that one of the main pro-trans activists was actually kind of in hot with the police, and it was hard in terms of addressing this, because the issue was brought up, if you question that you've been transphobic and so on. And in terms of kind of the reaction from other activists, it kind of pushed them more into a kind of economistic kind of position. And I'd say myself as well, I certainly moved towards, not ambivalent, but like, and certainly towards a more gender critical position for a period of time as a kind of reaction to that, and kind of sort of, I'm sure, some of the experience other people have had with liberal activists. And the point was, because you couldn't have a debate on this question, you know, and I would have liked to have had a debate, you know, not a debate even, just a conversation with a trans activist or a trans person, you know. But then the culture wasn't for that. And I think you could have probably dealt with the issue. And instead, it became more and more polarized and unable to, you know, reach a positive conclusion. And I've just was thinking, actually, you know, when you think about like the liberation movements in the 60s and 70s, it was a period where like the working class was much stronger, you know, more social rights and all the rest of it. And the trans liberation movement has entered the fray, if you like, in a period of defeat. And I imagine that colours how it's evolved. And I think my conclusion from all of this is, you know, it seems to me that actually the biggest victims of identity politics are trans people themselves, because I guess certainly a lot of really good activists react to trans people is coloured by that kind of toxic experience of liberal activists being hectoring and the inability to have a conversation. You know, literally a conversation, open conversation would probably have derailed a lot of the negative things that certainly happened in my experience, and I imagine has happened elsewhere. But, you know, and I guess, you know, destroying identity politics in a sense, or transcending it, is kind of, can only be done in one respect by trans activists themselves. And they, as I said, they seem to be, I'm actually nervous even talking about it, because, you know, I don't want to say the wrong thing, or you don't want to cause effect, but no, do you know what I mean? And it's such even within, you know, like arriving at a good place. But it was a great talk, thank you.
Hold on a second, I think we have a new.
Can you see it?
Yeah, it's not either. Oh, okay, yeah.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you all for those contributions. I will try to go through them in some degree of order, but there's a couple of recurring themes, so I'll probably move around quite a bit. Anne was the first person to bring up intersectionalism. I didn't really touch on it in the talk, but obviously I do have some things to say on that topic. I mean, I think that intersectionalism is a great example of the poverty of the bourgeois academy in addressing, in that it's been taken up by people, especially young people, who are searching around for a theory of oppression and their own experience. And I think I want to echo Jack's point, which is that really this is a failure of the Marxist left. And I want to keep saying that, because I didn't say it in my talk, but I absolutely agree. You know, this is a failure of the Marxist left to put forward an popularize an adequate theory. I mean, with intersectionalism, I mean, I'm not going to put my foot in the legal, because it originates in legal theory, right? Kimberly Crenshaw writing about workplace discrimination law, and I'm sure that it's perfectly adequate in that environment. But what happens is that it moves out of that space and into this broader academic discourse, which the way that I've analogized it is that you have, you know, somebody writes a maybe incorrect but relatively intelligent book, which is then misunderstood by a bunch of academics, who then misteach it to a bunch of students who only half listen, and then they talk about it on Instagram, and that's basically where most young people get their political ideas from. So I think that, you know, that's like the kind of level we're operating on, and I don't have any heat for Kimberly Crenshaw. Like, I've read a little bit of that sort of stuff. I'm not a legal scholar, but, you know, I think that's fine. But I think that the way that it metastasizes is totally bankrupt politically. I think on the feminists, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that we should, like, I didn't talk about this as well. Like radical feminism as it emerges, and then the transition from the radical feminist trend into what becomes termed like the cultural feminists. You know, this is a really good example of this politics of injury. And to give a really concrete example, right? You have the entrance of this radical women's movement. It is putting forward sort of a radical politics against women's oppression. And then it is very radical, albeit non-Marxist. And when it transitions into the sort of cultural feminism, the oppression of women becomes the source of women's like special qualities, you know. So you have feminists who talk about the divine feminine, you know, where the return to the kind of all mother, you know, women give life, and the reason why men oppress women is because they have womb envy, you know, this kind of stuff. That is a form of slave morality. Right? It is taking oppression and saying, actually, it makes me a good person that I experienced this. I'm actually better than you. And that's it makes you feel good, but it does nothing to arm you for the struggle. I think I wrote this in response to Marcus. I don't quite remember what I was responding to, though. I think it's stuff about speech controls. I think the way that we have to argue this case, because I think that the way we argue this is we have to argue it on the basis that this is a struggle for political independence. that oppressed people cannot rely on the liberal state. It is not a reliable ally for them in their struggle to overcome discrimination and oppression. The reality is that even though it may have been an alliance of convenience and it's benefited plenty of NGO bureaucrats, etc., it has not been it has ultimately led these movements into a blind alley, which has now positioned them to be the targets of a conservative counteroffensive, which is now which is like grinding these people into the dirt, right? Which is like mobilizing racist agitation, which is mobilizing anti-gay and anti-trans chauvinism, etc. And the alliance with the liberal state has totally hollowed out these movements, weakened them politically. The example of gay, lesbian, Mardi Gras is a really good example. I think that we should be aware that, like, yeah, the response to the mainstream, I guess, liberal mainstream version of identity politics in the oppressed community is usually the first form that it takes is a radical form of identity politics. And we should be critical. I generally think we should be critical and sympathetic. It's like these people they're looking for a weapon. This is what they have lying around, and we have not provided them with an alternative weapon. I think that, the sort of multiculturalism from below that you talked about, I totally agree. And I think that we do, as Marxists, need to develop a radical critique of multiculturalism. I like the term revolutionary integrationism, which comes out of the sort of Richard Fraser's writing about the Black struggle in the United States. This idea of we want to integrate communities, we want people to intermix on a revolutionary kind of radical basis, right? But this has a kind of cosmopolitan, positive character, but we want the intermingling of peoples on the basis of free association, right? And then that's a positive program. I think that that now is the best moment to make a critique of speech controls. It's the best moment because these hate speech laws and university code of conduct policies are being used to smash the Palestine solidarity movement. And this is not some abstract thing. I experienced this, right? I was at the University of Queensland Gaza encampment. I sat there in the fucking tent. I did it. And it was the weapon that the university used was, you guys are doing hate speech, it's anti-Semitism, we have a university code of conduct, we'll expel you if you keep attending these protests. They banned the use of the word intifada, they banned, the use of certain slogans. And now, on the basis of those same hate speech laws, the Queensland state government has banned these rules. If I was back home in Queensland, it would be illegal, literally illegal for me to say, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And people have been arrested and threatened with multiple years in prison over this on the basis of the same hate speech laws. And so this is a really good opportunity for us to make an argument to the left, is that these hate speech laws, which you previously championed, they have led us into a situation where the bourgeois state has been armed with weapons to attack the anti-imperialist movement. We need to, and I said this at the time, I have always opposed these laws because I knew that this would happen. We have been vindicated, and I feel we're not making enough hay out of it. I think that on that basis, though, we should make it absolutely clear when we argue this, what we are not arguing for is a non-aggression pact with chauvinism. Is that, like, when we say, oh, we don't think there should be, like, censorious kind of policies here, we're not saying, oh, everyone should just, like, sit around and sing Kumbaya, and if somebody, calls you a tranny, you should just let it go. No, it's not a non-aggression pact. We need to call this stuff out, and I think that's a very important point, because one of the reasons that these movements did not find an expression in the labor movement was exactly because of the weakness of Marxism and the kind of popular frontist kind of orientation of Marxism in this period, and because of the chauvinism of the labor movement. I mean, the reason why radical feminism emerges as a distinct trend in the United States, and it's not just the labor movement, it's also the new left, is because you have people in the civil rights, Black Power movement, and in the student SDS, these kinds of areas, fucking Stokely Carmichael is saying that the position of women in the movement is prone, right? This there's a reason why women like Shulamith Firestone, these kind of people who were serious militants for human emancipation, even if we might have critiques of them politically, they lead these movements and pursue an independent women's politics. And I think that our response to that, I agree with that, we have to be absolutely right on for liberation struggles. We have to say, down the line, we support you. And we're not going to sit there and say, tut-tut, we sit on the sidelines and tut-tut, Palestinians about being nationalistic. Of course they're nationalistic. You would be too, like if you lived under the boot of oppression. And it's not to say that we should just tail their politics and never raise any, because there are problems with Palestinian nationalism. I think, the fact that the revolutionary struggle in the Middle East is not going to be resolved at the level of the individual nation state. But this is partly a result of the failure of socialism in one country. There's real things that we have to say to that. But the point isn't, hectoring from the sidelines. The point is to be in the struggle, be in the movement, etc. What else do we have? The state patronage stuff. I think this is really important that we understand this. I appreciate Yasmin's point about this, and that I want to say that this is not a new phenomenon. And I actually think the model, this idea, this is actually an example of a kind of Foucault's boomerang kind of scenario, because this model of state patronage was first applied in the colonial world, by the European colonial powers, be it Maronites in Lebanon, right? You take a minority, you elevate them within the colonial structure based on some arcane kind of understanding of what's going on in the country, and you privilege them with the view that this minority will fight tooth and nail to keep the colonists in the country because they know that they would be massacred as collaborators if the colonialists withdraw. This was tried and true. It happened all through Africa. It was the basis of the Tutsi-Hutu conflict. The Belgians, the French, the British, all of these powers did this. And this is exactly the policy that is now being used to create state patronage networks in the advanced capitalist countries. I agree also about the spread of this kind of politics to the third world. This is, often people, I think, in the West will say, this is a problem with the Western left. If you think it's a problem with the Western left, I invite you to go to South America. Because this stuff is totally dominant in the Latin American left, in the student Latin American left in particular. You go to a university in Mexico, some of our comrades in CU have just been over there for 6 months. This politics is totally dominant. It's still 2013 down there. It's really intense. So if you, I really do think that this isn't just some problem with first worlders not knowing what's going on, etc. This is a systematic problem. It's something that's developing. On Mike's contributions, I think they're really useful, basically. On the relationship between this identitarianism and the right, I think that a really good example you didn't mention is Russell Means of the American Indian movement, who ran as the Libertarian candidate for president, or vice president, president, I think. And he mobilized an identitarian argument to attack influences of Marxism, sort of Maoist Marxism, in the American Indian movement. He says, Marxism is just as alien to my culture as capitalism, and we need an authentic indigenous kind of, thing. And then he runs as the Libertarian candidate for president, so On the comrade who made the point about how we approach these questions, like chauvinism, etc. How do we have these debates in a way which becomes productive? I think that obviously the intermingling of comrades is very important here. I think that a lot of transphobia is a lot of transphobia, same with racism, once people actually meet people and are able to have civil conversations, this kind of antagonism is usually a lot less sharp. But I think that there is in the 20s and 30s, the Communist Party of America, for all their faults, I think, and I'm not going to say this is a generalizable or universalizable thing, had adopted an essential division of labor when dealing with black oppression, which was that it was the role of black militants to fight the sort of nationalist trends in the black movement, and it was the role of white comrades to fight white chauvinism. I think that to apply that today, I would say the division of labour should be that when we're engaging with the trans movement, is that trans comrades, not saying on basis of an identitarian thing, but I think it makes a practical division of labour. Non-trans comrades should see their primary task as attacking the chauvinism that trans people are being attacked with from straight society. And trans comrades should see their primary task as attacking the identitarian miasma and all this kind of bullshit in the trans movement. That should be our primary focus. The degree to which we don't have to write articles about trans people getting attacked is the degree to which we can mobilize our forces against these layers who are weakening our liberation movement to the degree that it even exists. I think that covered everything I wanted to say. What time is it?
We are at 10:30.
Okay.
So you got like 20 minutes.
If there's any more people, I would happy to answer some more questions, but otherwise I'm also happy to let people go get an early rest. I'm not going to keep them there. Thank you all for having me.
Yeah, thanks. Anyone have a short question or, yeah? Anne?
Yeah. Okay, so, all right, so thank you again for your presentation and your responses there, like your passion, you're coming back there. It's a nice, ingredient in a discussion, isn't it, when you feel something strongly to articulate that. Anyway, so I study the Russian women's movement, and so my experience of studying that so I look at in the 1920s, the creation of the women's department, and I look at their enormous difficulty in getting men to take up their struggle. And this happens from the very beginning, like they have a commitment in the Constitution to women's equality. And yes, the situation within the country is very, very difficult because of the fact that it's surrounded on all sides and there are all sorts of difficulties in making progress on any level. But what you have is you have this group of women come together and then create something which is actually extremely innovative and popular among working class women. They set up these delegate-based bodies in the factories and districts throughout Russia, and they can make very many criticisms of them. But what they're trying to do is create an organization that is supported by their male comrades and that they make it their own, that they become the tribune of the working class in that sense, do you know? So, but that doesn't happen. And like again, I've said before that there are reasons for it beyond the control of those people involved, but it was a very big issue. So then what happened after that, of course, when the USSR changes and it doesn't really articulate that politics anymore. I mean, it uses it in a way to win support by posing as, the supporters of women's rights. Nobody has it as good. But throughout the left internationally, the experience of that movement is lost. The agency of it is lost. And when I first came to Britain and I was going to some Communist Party meetings, now I suppose I would say I was a feminist at that stage. I mean, I liked Julian Firestone and Woodrow, for that matter. I was interested, but I mean, I was appalled by the way in which women were not involved in the movement and the way in which that whole history of struggle had been lost. So I think when you say it's the lack of the communists, it's a historical lack in our movement. So when the 1960s comes along, the communist movement is not in a position to take any real part in it, to give it any leadership. Now, I know that after that, they shifted to popular frontism. And like, really, that's kind of my question, you know, I was connecting with Mike, is that their response to these real issues was to adopt a popular frontism rather than to seek what I would call the more meaningful, more principled approach of the genital, was to make it like a, you know, to, how can I say, to converge your struggles in a way that was, you know, possible, which made it possible to make progress. So I suppose I just really want to ask you that.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. I think that the,
Hold on, unmute, please.
I think, yeah, look, I agree. I think that the popular frontism of the kind of Euro-communists really in a way mirrors, I mean, it is a return to the kind of, or what about matter, the Mandalite, you know, movement of movements kind of formulation, which is basically the same thing. It mirrors, so in one hand it mirrors popular frontism, but on a deeper level, I think it also mirrors a fundamental kind of conceit of Stalinism, or even before that, which is the idea of, you know, consecutive national revolutions. This idea that, like, well, we're going to have a women's movement, and we're going to have like a gay movement, and then there's the labor movement, and then there's the environmental movement and the peace movement. It sort of mirrors the notion that there's like there's an Italian road to socialism, and a French road to socialism, and a Russian road to socialism, and a British road to socialism, and these kind of have a relationship with one another, but they're fundamentally distinct kind of phenomena. And I think that this reflects a kind of fundamental inability to understand the interpenetration of these phenomena. That, like, there isn't going to be a emancipation of women absent the transition to a socialist society. And so a women's movement that is kind of divorced from proletarian revolution is dead on arrival. I think that especially in the context where where the liberal state has been willing to concede the limits of legal formal equality, but the sort of transition to substantive emancipation and equality is elusive, right? I think that yeah, I think that this kind of I think that, and also vice versa, obviously. I absolutely agree about the fact that this is a failure of the Communist Party and the failure of the Communist movement. Like, I mean, women's issues I'm not as familiar with, but the position of the Communist parties on gay oppression was fucking abysmal. In the sort of 50s. I mean, it was the Stalin position, you know, kind of. Yeah, I'm sure Mike has something to say about this. And you know, but I think that, and God, the Maoists, geez, I mean, I don't have a huge amount of knowledge on this stuff, but what I know, it's not great. You know, and what this, and same of the old, I mean, it even goes back and mirrors the old Socialist Party of America's position on black oppression, which was that they were against racism, except on the right of the party, where they would kind of give a bone to the anti-immigrant chauvinists, etc. But, you know, they were against racism, they were for equality, but they didn't have a specific program to address black workers, and there was a reason why the party stayed mostly white. It was only when the Comintern began to really take up the black question as part of its sort of turn to the East. This is before they adopted the Black Nation thesis, but still, that you got the African Blood Brotherhood, which was a black nationalist organization that then moved in the direction of communism because of the Russian Revolution. You know, Cyril Biggs and his kind of whole group. And they fused with the Communist Party on the basis of the communists really seriously taking up the program of black liberation. So we have to be serious about taking up this politics. We're to make it part of our program, not on the basis of like an unprincipled combinationism, but on a basis of a real internalization of the historical program. And the stuff on Zinodel, I really want to engage more with, and we can talk about it afterwards.
Thank you. Mike, do you want to come back? Because I saw I had a little hand. So if you want to be quick.
Sorry, very quick. To Anne's point, the CP in the 1960s did have a perspective which issued in the Ford equal pay strike in, I guess, 67, 68. Yeah. These guys were involved in that stuff. What came out of that was the Working Women's Charter campaign, which involved women from the tanky wing of the CP and women from the IMG and the other Trotskyist groups, and from Big Flame, the soft Maoist phenomenon. Yeah. And then, yes, the Euros then countered that with B. Campbell and the theory of socialist feminism as being that there are separate understand women's struggle is separate from the workers' struggle, and then you have to subordinate the workers' struggle to the women's struggle. That was sweet freedom, those guys. Roxy, it was guys in the CPUSA who formed Mattachine, which was the first American gay rights organization in the 50s. There were guys in the CP who were involved in what became Campaign for Homosexual Equality. I can't remember what it's called before that. Again, 60s. So that it was it wasn't quite, yes, there was this Stalin line, and it's a Marx and Engels line, because actually if you go and look at things that Marx and Engels say about sexuality, it's pretty progressive, but there's an inconsistency there. But I also want you said there's a link to social one country and national roads, but I want to be cautious about that. The other side of that, Santuccio, Argentinian author, El Único Camino, the only road to workers' power and socialism. And the only road to workers' power and socialism, according to Santuccio, in every country, so common line in every country, armed struggle. And the prolonged People's War. So you can perfectly well have reject national roads, but still have a fucking mad political line.
Closing statement.
Money? You have to stand there.
Yeah, then suddenly the time.
I mean, you've had.
When you say stuff that we don't like,
Yeah, I just thought I'd just add in that I think precisely things really echoing I just think things are much more complex than that. So precisely you had, I don't know what you want to call them, hardline, anti-Euros taking the lead in women's questions. For example, at Ford's, there was also the cleaners struggle. There were plenty of struggles. At the same time, that faction produced something called Straight Left as their own journal. And that wasn't an accident, right? Straight, right. So in the same way, again, I don't know enough about it, but I mean, if you look, for example, at the German party, right? I'm sort of treading on very thin ice here, had a much more, how should I put it, thoughtful, wild, experimental approach to this question. And certainly if you take the Soviet Union, it went just violently conservative. And I agree with Mike, and I just wanted to add in terms, I don't know enough about Marx, I know about Engels and his remarks about homosexuality. Precisely, we need to have a discussion about it. And if you cannot have a discussion about what was wrong with Engels, and I don't know what words he used, I'm sure he used all sorts of highly unpleasant words, right? But we need a discussion. I really echo wherever he is now, Paul. We actually need to debate. And that doesn't mean we come, oh, well, let's just agree to disagree or something like that. That involves movement, doesn't it? That involves argument. We need the argument, but in order to have the argument, we've actually got to be able to express ourselves. So I just echo that approach, as opposed to, we can't hear this, we can't allow that, you mustn't offend this person or that section. We will offend people. And sometimes that's done deliberately, sometimes it's done accidentally. So what?
There are consequences of not harm. There are negative consequences of not harm.
That was really the point I was trying.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add. I mean, yes, I think that, I mean, thank you everyone for the discussion. It's been very interesting. And I think that, yeah, we'll continue this discussion on. It will be an ongoing conversation. Yeah, thank
Cool.
you everybody for
Thank you
listening
so
to my talk.
much. And thank you all, and we'll be back at 3:30 here with Tina and Marcus on why history keeps repeating itself. So, see you later.
Do you need any help at all?
You need to join this room as a panelist. You're not joined as a panelist yet.
It's in one piece.
Really nice.
Steve, you get 2 mentions. 2 mentions.
Steve Freeman and his halfway houses.
Yep.
Yep.
One's positive mention, one's
Oh, I'm sorry you felt like that.
because she's sexist.
That's right. Oh, bless. Felt like that.
Can comrades get themselves ready, please? We do the start in a minute. Can I ask you to make sure that your phones are off or on silent, please, throughout the meeting? But mine, I think it could be ironic if mine starts to beat.
It'd be hilarious.
And then we can go.
Do you know what? Shit. I have to do this differently. Sorry.
A bit of a chart.
Oh my God, I'm getting so confused. I'm sorry. Yeah. Where my opening is.
Lord Barry's fault.
Very.
Is it going live?
Not quite yet.
He did have easy targets, like 2 times. Remember that?